Hello my friends, this is Lindy. Welcome to my channel, Lindy's Magpie Reads. It is Friday Reads time and I have got too many books to talk about in one video, so I'm going to do another video tomorrow focusing on the Indigenous books that I read. So, before I get to the books, what's been going on this past week? Well, we celebrated my sweetie's 65th birthday. She's the woman responsible for the art that you see behind me and in my other videos. And yeah, it was great to gather with friends and we had a good time. Starting with a morning glass of champagne and then a nap. That's what happens when you get old. It's very cold, by the way. That's why I'm all bundled up today. This morning when I got up, it was minus 27. That's Celsius. I think that's about minus 17 in Fahrenheit. Anyway, don't want to go out if I don't have to. So I'm just staying home, reading and making videos. Yesterday was December 1st, and so I started reading the first story in my short story Advent calendar. This is a nice little box, and each story is an individual little pamphlet. The first one was fantastic. It is by a Korean-American author, Caroline Kim, and I'm just going to read you a bit of the style of the writing. It's about a 14-year-old girl who babysits a younger girl who lives next door, and that family is a member of a very strict church, Bread of Life. And here's a description of what the people wear when there are gatherings over there at the Bread of Life house. The men wore black vested suits without the suit coats and hats. They looked like bad guys in a Western. The boys wore dark jeans and oversized white t-shirts. The women kissed each other on the cheeks without touching. The men shook hands gravely, like they had finally decided who should hang. Yeah. Anyway, she says she's a girl who hangs out with the Misfits. And it just so happens that some of the other books I was reading this week are also about misfits. So it's a nice piece of serendipity. And today's story, December 2nd, was, it's one by Randy Boyagoda. It's the first chapter in a new novel that he's writing, and it stands alone very well. Looking forward to reading more of that story whenever it's published. What else? Well, November 30th, I did my monthly wrap-up on my book blog. I'll leave a link to that below in case you're the kind of person who's interested in statistics. I don't like to talk about that too much on this channel because I don't want to feel like I'm bragging. It's just that I happen to read a lot, and being on BookTube and on Litzy, that book social media, helps me to feel like I'm not so much of a freak because I read so much. Anyway, yeah, so I read 40 books in November, and of those, 31 are by people of color or Indigenous authors. In fact, 21 of those are by Indigenous authors, so more than half of the books that I read. So that's thanks to the Skoden Indigenous Authors Readathon that I was participating in November. And I'm going to continue reading books by Indigenous authors. I'm not only learning, but I'm also finding these books very enjoyable. I had 2 book clubs this past week, the Feminist Book Club and Lesbian Plus Book Club. So I will be talking about those 2 books later on in this video. Oh yes, thank you for responses last week to my question about what animal was on this boy's shirt in the manga Our Colors by Gengoroh Tagame. Sean's husband Kenji said it was a dog. Christy, whose handle is Akasha Vampi, thinks it's specifically a pug dog. She's on Litzy. Or maybe a mole, she said. Scott of Gunpowder Fiction and Plot thinks it's a hippo, or his original thought was maybe a gorilla. Trish from Litzy was thinking otter. Meg from Mega Books, she's a vet, and she says it's definitely a pig. When I look at it and I see it's got these paw prints that look nothing like a pig's, it's got little tiny ears instead of a big ears that a pig has, and kind of whiskers. The face and nose seem all wrong for a pig. So I was thinking capybara. And then when I looked into capybaras, they don't have a tail at all. And they have a 3-toed footprint, not a 4-toed footprint. So maybe this is just a fantasy animal? I don't know. I'm still looking for answers if any of you have contributions to make. All right, on to the books. So I'm going to tell you about 5 books that I finished, and 3 of them are by queer authors. Starting with this big coffee table book, What It's Like to Be a Bird, by David Allen Sibley. Now it's subtitled From Flying to Nesting, Eating to Singing, What Birds Are Doing and Why. This is absolutely gorgeous, full of art with life-size birds in it. So if the bird's too big, you'll just see one part of it, like this egret's head, the pelican, the cormorant. The first section talks about general information, fascinating sorts of things about their feathers, about their sense of smell, nesting, that sort of thing. In the hearing, I learned why it is that birds who have really loud calls don't deafen themselves. The jay is an example of that. So that the physics of it is explained in here. Plus there's an additional thing that birds have the ability to restore damaged healing by regrowing the little hairs that are inside their ears. Humans can't do that. About food, a little tiny bird like a kinglet requires a lot of fuel in the winter, and the equivalent for a human being in one day to what a kinglet eats would be 27 large pizzas. And chickadees, I adore chickadees. They hide individual seeds to prepare for winter, and they store about 1,000 seeds a day in little crevices in bark and so on. And they remember where they put every one of them. So in a season, they can store about 80,000 seeds. Another thing that's mentioned is that even birds that are eating from garbage in the street or bird feeders, when they're feeding their young, they will give them the most nutritious food. So the adult birds might be eating, trash from next to a fast food restaurant, but they'll be feeding live insects and so on, or seeds with a lot of oil in, to their offspring. They know what the healthy food is. So this is an expensive book. It is $47 in Canada. It says $35 in the US, which is probably the difference between the exchange. Anyway, it would be a fabulous family gift because this is definitely a book that can be appreciated by all ages. Just so impressed with it. And my next door neighbor passes along puzzles to me when she's finished them. And so this is the one I'm going to do next. I can't remember which library book I found this in, but I just wanted to show you. Somebody did some drawings. And hey, birthday, Lori's birthday. Kind of cute. I like finding things in library books. So next, I'm going to tell you about an audiobook that I listened to, Diary of a Misfit, a Memoir and a Mystery by Casey Parks. So this is how the audiobook starts. A few months after my pastor asked God to kill me, my mom ran to the bathroom and I ran after her. This is when her mom starts to shun her. Later on in the book, about chapter 7, the scene with the pastor and him getting everybody to pray that Casey will die and God will take her immediately up to heaven. What can I say? She grew up in a small town in Louisiana. And she came out in the 21st century, so it wasn't like it was years and years ago. But when she came out, her grandmother told her about a person that her grandmother knew who lived across the street, who was a woman who lived as a man, somebody named Roy. Casey decided to find out more about Roy. And when she got a little older, she went to university, became a journalist, moved away to Portland. For each holiday that she had, once a year, she would travel back to her hometown and try and find out more about Roy by interviewing people. So she spent more than 10 years working on a documentary, and instead she ended up with this book, which is a combination of her research about Roy and her own memoir. And I think it works quite well. There were lots of times when I felt impatient with Casey because she was so fearful. She was afraid that the people she was interviewing would surmise that she was also queer because she was asking about this gender non-conforming person. And this area was pretty homophobic. And I could understand her hesitancy, but it was also kind of painful, if you know what I mean. Casey's family is one in a situation of poverty, substance abuse, family violence, and that was hard sometimes to witness as well. But Casey's love for her family also comes through very strong. Eventually, Casey's mom does become supportive. When Casey tells her mom that she's going to be taking this narrative nonfiction writing class, her mom says, "Does this mean Diary of a Misfit is going to be a book I can actually buy?" she says, well, I have to write it first and sell it. Then who knows, people might not be interested. And her mom says, I'll whoop their ass if they're not interested. Towards the end of the book, Casey has been out of the closet for 17 years. And yet, when she goes back to Louisiana, she still feels like she needs to hide her identity. So, a certain amount of tragedy there. Ultimately, a very hopeful memoir. After I finished listening to the audiobook, Diary of a Misfit, which is read by the author, I looked through the audiobooks that I had checked out in Libby. I had a few there. And I decided I was in the mood for more Misfits. So then I listened to Rebent Sinner by Ivan Coyote. Originally, I read this in print format, so this was technically a reread, and it is the author who reads the audiobook. Ivan Coyote is a trans, non-binary storyteller, originally from the Yukon, and now lives, I think, part of the time in Vancouver and part of the time in the Yukon. And these are true stories about what it's like to live in the body that they have and to do the work that they do, which is a lot of getting up on stage, talking to high school students, sometimes hundreds at a time, about their life, traveling while trans, looking for washrooms while trans, and interacting with people on the street, friendly and not so friendly. I have never been disappointed by anything that Ivan Coyote writes. In Rebent Sinner, there's a section where they say that things got significantly better after I first picked up a book called Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. Even though the story was set in the 50s, in a blue-collar side of a very urban American city, I found echoes of myself and much comfort there. I remain convinced that book saved my life. I think that Ivan Coyote's stories have gone a long way to saving other people who are perhaps somewhat like them, or a lot like them. Next up, a book that I read for my Lesbian Plus book club last night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lowe. This is a big fat historical fiction set in the 1950s, McCarthy era. It's about a Chinese American, Lily, she's 17, and she falls in love with another high school student, a white girl named Kath. The two of them sneak out at night to go to a lesbian bar, the Telegraph Club. The vivid details are not only the sights and smells and general vibrant life of Chinatown where Lily lives, where there's quite a lot of diversity within the Chinese people there. There's mostly Cantonese, there's Shanghainese, there's Mandarin. The opening scene is a beauty pageant for Miss Chinatown, and it's an example of how the Chinese American community is trying to fit into larger American society as much as possible, to blend in. A book that I talked about last week, Our Missing Hearts by Celeste Ng, covers very similar ground. But that is all kind of a side plot, because main story is Lily and Kath falling in love, and what they face as a result of that. The first feelings of confusion and queasiness of the reality of going to a real nightclub like this versus what had Lily had imagined it would be like is just made so clear. I really loved those parts of the book. I did find that the back and forth timelines, we go back to find out more about Lily's father and in the earlier years and Lily's mother, and there's some of that back and forth that happens that didn't quite work for me. There are timelines in the book that actually made it seem a little more confusing. But at my book club, not everybody agreed with that. At least one other reader found the timelines really helpful. So still, I do recommend this book. I did give it 4 stars. Yeah, the other thing about this book is it is based on a short story. Well, it started out as a short story that Malinda Lo had written that's in the collection All Out, the no longer secret stories of queer teens throughout the ages. And I did read that story a couple of years ago. And so I kept thinking, did I read this or not? Did I read this or not? Until I got to the end. I thought, no, I didn't read this, but it seems so familiar. Until I got to the end and saw in the author's note. That was the explanation. Last up, this is my favorite book of the week, Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies by Maddie Mortimer. I'm sure many of you will have heard of this book already. It was on the Booker list. Lots of people on BookTube have loved it. The writing, oh my God. It's so playful. And it's a story about a woman dying of cancer. How did she make this book so great? Well, one of the voices in here is a voice from inside this woman's body, the voice of cancer in her. We also get to know her mother, and her early relationship with her mother was not good. But Anne is the mother's name. She really changes a lot over the course of the novel. Actually, all of the characters do. There's an experimental orthography that's used in here. For example, of words going over the page like that. And it doesn't seem gimmicky at all. It all fits. It's like a poetic essence that captures something ineffable that really enlarges the experience of reading this book. So in my feminist book club, when we were talking about this, one of the other members said that it really reminded her of Chaucer or some kind of medieval literature. Cancer refers to each of the characters in this story by just one descriptive noun, like the dove and yellow and the fossil and the gardener. And it does have a very mythic feel to it. I found it funny and very, very sad, but just so human, humane, I guess. Yeah, I loved it. Okay, well, that's all from me. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to any comments that you have. See you soon. Bye.